What is up, everybody? It is the Double G Show, and I have three people on this show who all have Hall of Fame ballots for the Wrestling Observer newsletter Hall of Fame. One friendly face who you may remember on this channel, Mike Gilbert from Voices of Wrestling, the Mike and JD Show. What is up, Mike?
Not much, man. Thanks for having me. It's been a long time since I've been on the Fight Game Media airways, and I'm excited to be back.
All right, and then two friendly faces. If you follow this channel, you see them every week. Jeremy Finestone, the host of Speaking of Strong Style. Paul Fontaine, the host of The Dynamite Show. Fellas, thanks for jumping on. So the reason why I wanted to do this is because I thought it was pretty interesting, and it just hit me this year that a community that we kind of created and put together had some seats at the table for the Wrestling Observer Newsletter Hall of Fame. And this goes back to 2008, and I'll tell you why, because Alan 4L, one Alan Cunahan, hit me up the other day, and he was like, hey, I'm trying to find all these old Wrestling Observer Newsletter history pieces that I wrote for getting guys in the Hall of Fame. And the old website is you can find some of that stuff in the archives on the internet, but I was just like, yeah, it's all that stuff is in a file somewhere that if I ever wanted to put it back, I would have to figure out how to do that. But anyway, Alan has a ballot, and John LaRocca has a ballot. John has had it for a while. He's had it before I did. And so then I just started thinking, I was like, okay, what is this little, like, you know, the little hierarchy here for people who have done content for us and who have kind of been in the mix as podcasters. And then I know Mike and JD both got ballots. And so I was like, hey, let's have a conversation with some folks who have ballots and just talk about kind of the journey of how we got here. And I guess we're technically all a part of the wrestling media at this point, but I wanted to call them out. So it's Alan, it's LaRocca, it's myself. Paul, you probably have had yours now for how long?
God, it could be as long as 10 years.
Okay, so you and LaRocca probably had it around the same time then.
Yeah,
I think I only got mine, like, I want to say 6 or 7 years ago, maybe.
Yeah, like one day I got that weird email from Dave where he's responding to an email I sent him 4 years earlier, and and it had the ballot on it. I'm like, oh. It was like way before COVID. So like I'm thinking like 2015, 2016, something like that.
And I believe Ryan Frederick has one as well.
Yep. Yeah, and he got his after me. I know that. Not long after me, a year or two maybe.
And Jeremy, how long have you had yours?
I want to say 3 or 4 years.
Okay.
I think 3. It just showed up in the email one day under a no subject, and the hell is this? Yeah. And oh my, what the hell?
How many of these ballots do you think just end up in spam and people have no idea? Like,
oh man, I think I did find one year in spam because everyone was talking about how they had theirs already, and I'm thinking, okay, either he dropped me from the list, or and then I checked my spam folder and it was there because no subject, and it's responding to like an email about, like a UFC pay-per-view buy rate or something.
So then also Scott E. Wrestling, who I invited to join, but I know he was kind of iffy on coming. And who else? Is there anybody else? Did I miss anyone?
From Fight Game?
Yeah. So I think that is it. I want to say that is the...
Yeah, I know Jeff does not have one.
Jeff does not have one.
Yeah.
Though historically he probably should, but he's kind of on the fence of whether he even wants one or not.
He said like even if he got it, he probably wouldn't submit it. Yeah, I think you mentioned Scotty.
But that's a good number of people, right? Because if you think about how we kind of all got together and what we put together, like the idea wasn't like, oh, like we want to become... Go ahead.
Lisa, I think, has one. She's
does she?
Kind of, like she's not quite a member of FGM, but she's definitely, a family friend.
Discord. She's in the Discord.
She's in the Discord.
And of course, people like John Muse and others. We have a nice discussion.
John Muse. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
We have a nice discussion going on in the Discord currently about the Hall.
Oh, and Dan Circa Dancy.
Yeah, Dan's. I think Dan's been on Dave's radar for a while now.
He's had a ballot for a long time. Brady Childs.
Brady has one.
Yeah.
So
Brady does the
Okay,
work,
so
by the way. I want to give Brady a lot of credit. Brady does the work in
Brady
advocating for
doesn't
his
need
business.
credit. Does Brady really need credit?
Just
No.
the one time. Just the one time I'm willing
No.
to do it.
Shit
Put
stir.
it on
That's what
record.
I get credit for.
I guarantee Brady got his by virtue of being so annoying that Dave was like, I just have to give it to this little shit in order for him to leave me alone. That's how Brady got his.
He definitely does the work though. Like
He does.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to give him his flowers.
Yeah.
Because I think there's at least one person that he changed my mind on, and we might get to it, and we might not.
Yeah.
There's
But I'll
one
tell him
that's
outside.
there's one on my ballot specifically because Brady tuned me into him. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
I may not have said anything, but I was paying attention.
Okay, so I know Mike is going to be on a bit of a deadline. He's got a young newborn baby. So congratulations to you and your wife and your family.
Thank
But
you.
I wanted to go quickly through kind of our journeys into actually getting the ballot. Like as a member of the wrestling media, this is all kind of there was no pathway for us to kind of be involved. We just kind of self-started and started doing stuff and reached out and worked with people. So you've told me your origin story before, Mike, but just for people who may be listening and not know, where does your journey to being a wrestling media personality start?
Yeah, so in 2017, like just on a whim, I decided I wanted to be a podcaster. So I hit up Cousin Joe, who's like, if you guys are in the Fight Game Media Discord, he's pretty active in there. He's a big
we
WWE
love
fan.
Cousin Joe. He keeps all of the WWE threads popping.
Yeah. So and he's like 10 years younger than me, but he was always kind of like my wrestling fan protege. Like I gave all my wrestling tapes that I had as a kid, I just gave them all to him whenever I shipped off to the Air Force, right? And he still has those. So he and I had been talking about it, like, you know what, I'm just gonna start a podcast. And so one day I just said, okay, I'm gonna do it. So I started looking up how to do it. And then I messaged Conrad Thompson on Twitter, and of all people, and I was like, and I told him, like, hey man, I have this podcast. It's a pretty big podcast, and I'd love to have you on as a guest, and maybe we can help each other out a little bit. And he's like, oh sure. He didn't even obviously didn't look into it. He's like, oh sure, man, I'll come on your podcast, and then he agreed to it. And I was like, shit, now I really have to do this podcast. I didn't have a microphone. I didn't have anything. So I went into Amazon 2-day shipping, just started getting stuff sent in, figured it out. I created a SoundCloud account. And then, so I put it on SoundCloud and YouTube. And like, he called me like 10 o'clock at night, and I could not get my microphone to work because it was an XLR mic. I don't know if you guys are familiar with what that is, but then it goes into like a little soundboard that then goes into your computer. And I could not get the thing to work. So I had to then unhook it from the soundboard, get it into my computer, and I could not connect my phone to the soundboard to order the computer. So I just held up my phone and had it on speakerphone. It sounded like crap. But here I am, and like Conrad's like pretty famous at this point. Like the Bruce Pritchard show is like huge.
Yeah.
So anyway, that was my journey. That podcast didn't last very long, but through that podcast is how I kind of probably got on Dave's radar through an online spat with Baron Corbin, where it essentially cost him the money in the bank briefcase at one point. And David actually wrote about me in his Observer, and like if you Google Mike Gilbert Baron Corbin, like all these articles pop up about how I screwed the guy over because of a Twitter fight. But so that kind of started, but the podcast didn't really last very long. I didn't stick with it. And then a couple years later, I had gotten into Impact Wrestling, and I just kind of noticed that Wrestling Observer Radio wasn't covering it anymore. They had just kind of stopped talking about TNA altogether. And they didn't even have a podcast for it. So I was like, you know what? I saw some Impact podcasts on YouTube. Like, I'm pretty sure I'm better than these guys. And I think there's an opening here. So if I just get back onto Dave's radar, he'll bring me onto the Wrestling Observer site doing TNA stuff because nobody else is doing it. There's a void here. I saw an opening. So I started writing some articles, and I didn't really get the podcast. And then eventually, Garrett, I was like annoying you to get onto the Fight Game Media show with you and John to talk about TNA. You offered me a spot to write because I had been doing some articles on my own site. And, next thing you know, I'm doing the Brace for Impact show on your website, on your network. And we did that for a long time. And that's still going strong on my Patreon, patreon.com/the Mike and JD show. But I had to get my plug in. So, but as far as getting my credentials, I, a couple years ago, I started kind of tweeting at Dave and trying to get on his radar, trying to get him to notice me again. I guess you just have to be a bot with no followers and say mean things to get him to notice you on Twitter. But go ahead.
How influential was being with Voices of Wrestling? That had to have helped.
I think, well, it wasn't until I got with Voices of Wrestling. So last year, here's where I made the mistake. I made an attempt last year. So JD and I actually did a Hall of Fame podcast where we were like, it was like, if we have ballots, this is who we would submit, right? And the whole design was to get on Dave's radar. We tagged Dave, we tagged the ballot tracker, we tagged everything. I then emailed it to Dave and said, hey, we did this for you. But the problem is we did it in November and right around when the ballots are due. And so that was my attempt to get on, but it was too late for him to give me one. So this year, we messaged Rich and Joe, and Dave knows those guys pretty well. And then we also messaged John Muse, and then all three of them vouched for us, sent Dave an email. And then I personally sent Dave an email. And then within 5 minutes, he had replied to the email, like, no, nothing, just like, here's your ballot. And like the same copy and paste email that everybody gets. And then I text JD, and it's like 1 a.m. where he's at. And he's like, oh shit. So he gets up and he's like walking his dog at 1 a.m. to sending another email to Dave. And then he got his immediately too. And so that's ultimately how we were able to get it.
Hey man.
I just remembered I got Josiah a ballot the same way you're describing, Josiah McDonald.
Oh, nice.
I sent Dave a text and said, this guy, he knows his stuff. He's been writing for your site for years. And and he got a ballot.
Yeah.
I've only tried to get one person a ballot, and it's my buddy Draven, who I do the Observe This show with. He's just not on Dave's radar. Like he doesn't care about that side of things. He just kind of does what he does, but he's been a subscriber since he was a kid. So he was even a subscriber before I was a subscriber. So he's like in, the mid to late 90s. I reached out one time because he's got a high knowledge of Mexico as well. But yeah, Dave never even got back to me. I'm sure if I bothered him about it, I could probably do it. But that was the only time.
Tell Draven to email him directly and talk about his knowledge. And if he highlights the fact that he would vote in the Mexico category, I think that would actually help the ballot.
That is the thing that Draven is unwilling to do, which is kind of like, not really beg for it, but kind of ask for it. He feels like it's a little pandering, and he wants to earn it in the way. But that's a lot of people, right? Like a lot of people don't really understand how to get on the radar.
Closed mouths don't get fed, bro.
Yeah, but at the same time, it is a responsibility to be a voter. It is if you are a voter, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Like, how does it change the way you view things? But Paul, why don't you talk about how sort of your journey to where you are now?
Yeah, like I remember when you did this a while ago when we right after we started Fight Game, you said, "Oh, we're going to do this thing introducing members of," and you're like, "Okay, Paul, I'm going to get to you, but we're going to do Mike first, then we're going to do," and you never did get to me, so I never did get to tell this story. So yeah, like I don't
remember, by the way, but
no, that's fine. Good, but I was writing. Like I used to write Dave letters and stuff, and we corresponded back and forth. Letters, emails, whatever. And then one time I just something, I was sending him feedback about something, and I just kind of went a little bit longer on my feedback than I normally do. And then the next thing you know, like I log into wrestlingobserver.com, and like my letter, he's published it as an article. And I'm like, oh, that's
didn't
cool.
even get your approval to do it.
No. And like at the time he still had publishing rights, which he doesn't anymore. But on his own website. But so then that eventually started to where like I did that a few more times, and then I eventually got a recapping job, quote unquote job with the site where, like I got my I got a free membership in exchange for like recapping Ring of Honor. I was doing, and I'm a Ring of Honor historian. And I was recapping Ring of Honor for a couple of years, and then I moved on from that to MMA, and I was doing Bellator, and when they still covered Bellator, and I was splitting the UFC with Ryan Frederick, and even doing some articles on UFC. And then eventually I started writing ratings articles, and at the time it was just SmackDown. Because Dave, for whatever reason, and to this day, still writes the Raw articles. He just has to
holds
do the
that
Raw
one
ratings.
near and dear to his heart.
Yeah, but I do everything else. So it grew from SmackDown to, AEW Dynamite to, Dynamite and Rampage, Collision, NXT. So I'm doing like everything. I'm almost an article a day. And then at one point, Tony Leader was like, "Oh, I feel like we should pay you. And I'm like, okay, cool. So like now I get a check, I don't get, not a check, but I get a deposit every month. So that was getting into wrestling media. And then, the podcasting was similar to Mike, like with you started up this network, and I was, one of the first people that came on. In fact, I think Ryan and I might've done the first show. If it was either the first or the second show within the clinch. And then we started the Dynamite show a little bit later. And as for the ballot, like I said, like one day, like Dave just sent me a ballot. Like I never asked for it. And, there's been a couple years where, like I mentioned, the one time I found it in my spam folder. There's been a couple other times when I didn't get it, like when everyone else did. So, I would just send Dave a quick email, and I'm like, hey, just curious, did I get bumped from the list? And he just, whatever, and probably forgot to send it to me. So, and that actually happened this year too. So like Mike, I sent him an email, and actually it was a text. I sent him a text, and then immediately I got an email back. So he was like, oh yeah, and so, yeah, so I've got that now. And yeah, and so I've been, probably about 10 years, like 9-10 years. So.
All right, Jeremy. So how do you go from, being a fan to being the guy that Tony Leader calls when Dave accidentally turns off his computer and can't figure out how to turn it back on?
Okay, you're really going there. Okay. So I was just a dude watching wrestling probably until 2018, just doing my own thing, talked with some friends, had a group of friends that I would just, like 4 of us, and we still keep in touch today. And it was a WWE pay-per-view that was in San Jose, in which the main event, I believe, was Becky Lynch versus Charlotte versus Asuka for the WWE title. It was around the time that Bryan Danielson turned and was wrestling AJ Styles, and Dean Ambrose had the horrible gimmick with the gas mask at the time with Seth Rollins. This was all in the card. And I was with my girlfriend at the time, now wife, and we were wearing the man shirts. We were just trying to get in on it, just to get in to like just doing something together, right? And you were at the show, and I think I chirped at you through Twitter. And I'm like, oh, this dude's local? I'm like, oh, this is weird. And because I lived a little farther away than I do now. And one thing led to another, and you're just like, hey, why don't you come out to like an APW show and we'll hang out and we'll, whatever. And what I didn't realize is like you were just kind of like feeling out people to introduce to Dave that were just like kind of normal people that enjoy wrestling.
It's not even to introduce to Dave. It's just kind of like we have this really kind of tight local community with John and myself kind of in the middle of it. And I just like, it's just cool. Like if you are a cool person, you should just come do this if you're already, involved in watching this stuff.
So you kind of brought me into the fold. And then I think I met Dave in like 2019, went to his house to watch some pay-per-views here or there. And you were doing the radio stuff, and then COVID hit, and I was hitting 40, and I was just bored. And I decided, all right, I'll get in on the radio stuff. I'll see if I am any decent on this in any way, shape, or form. And so I tried some stuff out with Mike, actually, some Brace for Impact stuff. And it wasn't really for me, but he and JD were able to springboard off of that and really do a lot of great stuff off of that. And I was just kind of here or there, WWE stuff, just kind of whatever. And one day I just like, I'm going to do a New Japan podcast. And you linked me up with this guy named Stephen Conway. And it wasn't until I kind of got serious about that I think David known me, but then he saw I was kind of doing something with that, and I kind of had some knowledge. And one day he just sent me a ballot, and it was after I started the podcast. And here we are now. He will ask me stuff about New Japan sometimes, what I think about that. And Tony Leader knew I was local. And so if that camera isn't working on the Dave podcast, I'm the guy that gets the call to go figure out what's going on with that. And sometimes people like to talk about it, sometimes don't. It's a funny little thing. It's a quirk, but Dave's Dave, and I like Dave.
What it shows is like, it's not like New Japan was like Jeremy's favorite thing in the whole wide world, but sort of like Mike, and he saw the niche for TNA Impact. Jeremy was like, I like this. There's an avenue here to talk about it. It's kind of maybe even underappreciated post late 2010s, and so this just now it's my thing. So it's a pretty cool way to kind of get in. I think all of us, it kind of in this like cool little community, but to a bigger extent, like the bigger wrestling media, like Mike, you see this because you work for a bigger unit with Voices of Wrestling, but because of the internet and because of podcasting, I feel like this space has grown a ton of late. Now, if we can get a few more women, and maybe more people of color, like we'll be in better place. But do you sense that like this is like a bigger thing than you had originally thought it was going to be when you first got in?
Yeah, because I'll be honest, I have seen part of my podcast, a lot of times I'm saying some pretty outrageous stuff. Like I grew up listening to Stern and Adam Carolla and those guys. And then I find out that some of the people that I'm talking about have heard it and have seen it, and they're paying attention to my Twitter, and it's come back to haunt me. It's come back to bite me in the butt a little bit. And it's like, okay, so now that it's gotten a little bit, look, I'm not making a ton of dough or anything like that. I'm not saying I'm famous, but there have been certain people in certain companies that have been paying attention to what we're saying, and they've let us know about it. And now it's kind of like, do I have to be a bit more careful? This thing's getting a little bit bigger. Like now I'm kind of like, I'm getting on some people's nerves, and I'm like, well, you know what? No, I don't think I'm going to change all that much. I think if I'm getting on people's nerves, that might be a good thing. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Especially if I'm getting on a little bit of like everybody's nerves, right? That probably means I'm doing things right. Because I don't want to be seen as a shill for anybody or anything. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I remember when I first started doing Wrestling Observer Radio with Dave, he would just randomly tell me, he's like, oh, yeah, I heard from X who said something about the show. And I was like, why are they even paying attention to this stuff? They should be like wrestling because they're top level wrestling, but they do listen. They pay attention, especially the people who want to understand the business better and want to understand how to maximize their leverage. They definitely listen. And similar to what Mike said, one of my friends, he told me, he said, hey, I'm hearing from some people at AEW that the Friday show that you do with Dave is a little bit more negative than the shows that Dave does with Brian. And at first I was like, wow, that's really interesting. And then much like what Mike just said, I was like, I actually like that because it just means that we're being as fair, or I'm being as fair as possible. Dave is trying to be fair, in most instances, in all instances, but like that shows specifically my influence and my my content. So I actually liked it. I was like, that actually made me happy. That's okay. I'm doing the right thing. I'm hitting the right tone on that show. Mm-hmm. If people think that, we're being a little harsh or whatever, because you got to be critical. I'm sure when Tony Khan came on with Dave and I, and he was like flexing with all the Wrestling Observer newsletter awards that they were winning, that is, he rightfully so, like they were doing well. And then now they're not doing as well. And so to feel that heat a little bit, that means that I'm probably being critical in the right moments. So Adam Berger, who does a lot of research on this stuff, he just said that Dave tweeted out that we have 9 new inductees.
We have them already?
Let's hope. So, okay. So
we don't have the names yet.
Dave started. No. Yeah, he didn't name names. Dave started doing ballots last week, I think. And then when I talked to him yesterday, he said he's just going to do them all weekend. I don't know if that means that he's done with them.
Going to drop the result and go on vacation.
But I he'll probably send me a text at some point about who they are. But 9 is good, and I hope that we scoop out some folks in modern. But I just wanted to shout out Adam because he does a lot of great work. He's got some stuff on Voices of Wrestling's website as well. He's a really good researcher, analyst. I don't know, Adam is not an older dude, so I don't know if he would even want to consider himself a historian, but just shout out to Adam. All right, Paul, before we get to this, somebody sent me a note in the chat before this even started, and it was specifically at you. So you, being the ROH historian, must also be the historian of Europe here. So the question is, For Paul, should Jose Torres go in without voting like Dan Koloff and Paul Pons, since he's the third biggest European draw in history?
Okay, so
It's from
I'll answer
Darius,
this.
by the way.
I'll answer this in a second. I just was reminded of something when Mike was talking. I'm a whore for myself, like I know Mike is, and I don't think either of you other two are. But so I at one point I used ChatGPT to ask who are the top 50 wrestling reporters today, and two people in this room were on that list. Who do you think they are?
Definitely not
Mike
me.
Gilbert and Paul Fontaine.
You got one right. So Garrett was number 20.
Okay.
And I was number 45.
Hey.
So now it's funny because like in this sphere that we're in, like I don't really ever think about myself as being like anyone. You know what I mean? Like, but when I've gone to some of these outings and I'll have people like come up that I've never met and say, "Hey, I love your show," or "I love your writing," and stuff like that. And it kind of hits me. And like, I'm on this huge, like, I look at Mike and he's on the Voices of Wrestling Network. And like, I'm jealous in a way because it's bigger than the network we're on.
Mhm.
But then I forget that I write for WrestlingObserver.com, which is like the biggest, and I'm
Oh.
actually paid, and
Paul.
most of the people that write for Wrestling Observer aren't.
Paul, you get to be on Wrestling Observer Radio with Dave. Talk about jealousy. I'm already begging Garrett for a TNA spot on there, like publicly, like shamelessly doing that because you got that spot. I'm like, Paul gets a spot and I don't.
So Darius asked me this question because he assumes, because I'm on Wrestling Observer, I might know something. But I will say I don't actually vote in that category. But based on the stuff that I've heard and I read a lot and I listen to podcasts, talking about this stuff. So I'm probably almost qualified enough to vote in that category, but because I've never really watched any of that wrestling and because I haven't done the research, I don't really feel qualified. But I would say, like, based on what Dave has said, I would say, that Torres should be in. I've looked at the ballot and just based on my knowledge, I wouldn't vote for any of the three names you mentioned. I'm looking at, I would probably go Gordienko, Billy Joyce, and maybe Otto Vance or the Royal Brothers. Those would be like my three choices if I was voting in that category, but I'm not. So maybe in the future, like I know we talked a little bit before here, Mike's mentioned that, like he feels like almost like he should. For me, like I do enough that I would stick to kind of my wheelhouse. And that would open up. I'd have to do so much research for myself to feel qualified to vote. So, but Jose Torres, I almost think that Dave should have just put him in.
That's where I
sit
sit
done
with
that before.
With a lot of the older wrestlers who kind of someone does research and then they kind of raise up their name again. Like there should be, I almost feel like it should be Dave and like 4 other people. And if they get unanimous votes on some of these folks who may have been overlooked originally, they should just put them in. Like they shouldn't even like put them to a vote. That's how I feel. But I'm going to pose this one towards Mike because Mike knows Lanza better than all of us.
Yeah.
But Darius
Thank you
also
for doing that.
Darius also says, with the hate of people like Lanza towards Roman, I don't see him going in soon. Hasn't Lanza turned the corner a bit on Roman?
Well, no, he still hates the whole bloodline thing. He still thinks it stinks. But I just did a podcast with him 2 weeks ago about this very subject, and he voted for Roman.
Yeah.
So like he said, Roman deserves to be in, whether I like him or not. Like he is a draw. He is a proven draw. He's a megastar, and he doesn't like the bloodline. He thinks it's all crap, but it's gotten over, and there's no denying it. Roman Reigns, in my book, is an undeniable Hall of Famer. I don't see how you could vote against him, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
I respect Lanza for saying that. Like honestly, like that tells me a lot about him.
Yeah.
Okay, so I know, people want to know folks who we actually voted for and all that. This is not going to be a show where, if you guys want to unveil stuff, you can totally do it, but it's not what it was designed to be. I'm interested, though, before I get to kind of my next question for you, who is the one person on this ballot who you absolutely stand for and was like, it bothers me that this person's not in, like we need to get them in, that this is just the person, this is number one. If you were to rank the people on your ballot, who would have been number one? And Paul, we'll start with you.
Well, I would say, Okay, I'm gonna go with one who I don't think is gonna get in, and I don't understand why. John Moxley has got to be in the Hall of Fame. Like I think it's ridiculous that he only got 20% of the votes. Every single person that's won Wrestler of the Year is in, and Moxley's won it twice. Like to me, it's like it's a no-brainer. I don't, and the funny thing is like you say there's a lot of people say there's an AEW bias in the Hall of Fame, and so people that like guys like Cody and the Bucks and Tony Khan for sure is going in as soon as he's eligible, and stuff like that. So Kenny Omega, I don't understand why Moxley isn't in. Like I really don't, and I felt the same way about Mystico. And then one year he was just in overwhelmingly. So I feel like at some point people are going to wake up and go, why haven't we been voting for Moxley? And then he's just going to go in. So there's people I think are maybe stronger candidates, but he's one that should be on everyone's ballot, in my opinion.
All right, Jeremy, what about you?
So there's a lot of argument for a lot of people that I saw all over the place for the last couple of years. The one that I have had on my ballot every year, and no one really asked me about it, just kind of there, is Manami Toyota and Toshio Yamada. And they are in the Japanese category. Manami Toyota had 17 5-star matches rated by Dave. And Toyota and Yamada actually, in 1993, had the Wrestling Observer newsletter match of the year over every other match that happened in that year. The idea of two women being up for a ballot in the Wrestling Observer newsletter, something noteworthy, something that no one has done before, that checks off all the boxes for me. And so that's the one that I stand by, that I'll argue for until I don't have a ballot anymore, or that they made it through.
So the caveat here is you're talking about the tag team, right?
Yes.
Them as a tag team. Do you know how many years were they together as a tag team?
I think it was about 5.
Okay.
I think it was like 91 to 96.
So Scott E., who I thought was going to join us, is in the chat, says Jeremy gets points from me.
Yeah. Hey.
All right, Mike, who is the number one priority for you on this ballot?
You can't just I can't just give you one, right? I'm too long-winded to give you just one, but I'll try to stick to just one. But so I think it's a shame that Paul Orndorff is not in. And I think everybody always talks about his run with Hogan as being the reason why that he should be in, but it's so much more than that. The guy was a big draw in Georgia, big draw in Mid-South, big draw in Florida. And then when he got to the WWF, he was Hogan's greatest opponent, his greatest drawing opponent. Other than Andre, it was him, and the house shows did better than the Andre shows.
He was also the backup for WrestleMania 3 if Andre wasn't able to go.
Yeah, and they drew what 60 some odd thousand in Toronto, and that was essentially just the local house show.
House show, yeah.
Right. That was just a localized show. That show's not look. Hogan is the draw there, but Orndorff helped definitely get him over the line on some of the biggest shows. He was Hogan's greatest opponent. I think that warrants him being in. Unfortunately, with Orndorff is that a lot of his Mid-South Georgia and Florida stuff isn't really seen on television, and WWE
lost time. Yeah,
I'm actually watching the stuff now that he's doing in Mid-South, that he did in Mid-South.
Yeah. They never really did a good job of telling those stories.
WWE Network.
Yeah. Brian and Vinny show are covering it. So
is it on Peacock?
No,
yeah.
So they have the weekly shows, which is from a studio on Peacock, but they don't have the big Superdome shows and all that.
But they show highlights
from the 70s and early, like pre-84. They have some of the later Superdome shows, but they didn't really do a good job of advertising those. And hopefully the WWE Vault account can go back and find some of those shows that he headlined, in the Omni, and then of course like in the Superdome and things like that. Like the guy was a legitimate mega draw, and when he died, nobody really knew that until he died. And then when he died, Dave wrote the obituary, and then when you read that, you read the statistics, I'm like, statistically, he's a Hall of Famer, right? Just based off of ability and drawing power alone.
I have this bias, and it is against people who I grew up thinking were awesome, and just thinking they were awesome for that time in WWF. Because if you asked me, is Paul Orndorff one of the most important wrestlers of your childhood, it would be absolutely 100% yes. But that bias kind of leans me against voting for him until Dave did all that research. And I think JD even wrote something about Orndorff as well. And so when you read it, you're like, oh, okay. So the inherent instinct that I have to go, oh, no, the stuff from my childhood that I'm like making up way bigger than it really was, it actually is validated that he was that good. And so once I saw that, I was like, okay, he's going to be one of the first people that I write down every year.
Yeah. And then secondly, just shout out Steiner Brothers. I know Paul, I tried to convince you one year. I put them on my ballot this year.
I voted, but I won't vote for Rick. It's the only one I won't vote for because of
I understand there's way worse people already in the Hall of Fame. But I completely get that. But if we're only voting for the nicest people, then we're going to start removing a lot of people from that Hall of Fame.
Well, Punk wouldn't be on my ballot.
But I just Rick and Scott were such a tremendous tag team, very innovative tag team, influential tag team. One of the biggest tag teams of the WCW era of the late 80s, early 90s, did big business in Japan, was obviously the WWE or WWF tag team champions. They had a tremendous run. The Frankensteiners, one of the most over moves in the history of pro wrestling, super influential on all the modern tag teams. And then anybody that's out there doing series of suplexes, they got that from the Steiner brothers, right? Yeah. So in any amateur wrestling type of pro wrestler, when they want to get into the business, they don't go looking at Danny Hodge and Vern Gagne. If they want to be exciting and they want to get themselves over, they go look at the Steiner brothers. I think they deserve to be in. Rick Steiner's a complete jerk, though, to be honest with you. Like, I don't want him to babysit the kids. I don't want him to teach my, ethics classes, but I'll watch the guy wrestle. And the Steiner brothers versus the Nasty Boys from Halloween Havoc 1990 remains one of my favorite matches of all time. And then I also love popping in that match against Lex Luger and Sting. So
that's the high spot match of my childhood, right there.
I love their Japanese stuff. I just
Orndorff went back on the ballot last year, right? He wasn't on it before.
I think after he died, he got put back on.
Right.
Yeah, because of the obituary.
Yes, I think Dave put him back on last year, and he was on my ballot last year, and he's on my ballot this year as well.
The thing about the Steiners, it's really interesting, and Paul loves these A&E documentaries that WWE does. And when I saw the one on the Steiners, I'm like, there's not a ton of stuff out there about them. And so I watched it. It was kind of disappointing. Like, I'm thinking like Mike growing up on them and thinking that they are so Darius, by the way, Jeremy said that Orndorff was put back on at 22.
Perfect. Thank you.
So
smart.
So yeah, Darius is doing our homework for us. Maybe he has one. Who knows? So I watched it thinking like, does this match my childhood memories? And they glossed over a lot of stuff. Unfortunately, they glossed over anything woman related because she is not with us, and they don't want to remind people of that nastiness that happened. So watching it, I was like, gosh, this is kind of disappointing. But I think the thing that I wonder about that might hold me back from voting for them, somewhat what Paul said, but like you said, Ty Cobb is also in the Hall of Fame for baseball. When wrestling, when the Monday Night War begins, as a tag team, they're kind of in the mix in the beginning.
Yeah.
But they're bouncing back and forth, and they're not really a big deal in the entire Monday Night War. Now, some of that is politically, they're not Hogan's homies, right? And it's not until they split up that Scott actually becomes the wrestler that most people remember him as. So that is a little bit of a demerit, but I don't have anything really against them. And I'm sure down the line, if it counts, if your genetics count, then you get Braun Breaker. You have a child like Braun Breaker, that maybe that gets them over the edge. But do you guys know, before the Frankensteiner, I have it in writing what Dave called the move.
Reverse victory roll?
No, he mentioned it, and I can't remember the name, but it was
wacky. The Mata Head Sisters. But then he said in the same sentence, like, they got to really come up with a better name than this for such a crazy move.
Do you have an answer for this question, Garrett?
So my two are Roman Reigns CM Punk is the other one.
Yeah.
And you know what's interesting about CM Punk is I think one way that you can measure impact is what happens when that person leaves.
Yes.
And
Mhm.
as big of an impact as he was in AEW, like he did raise their game so high, him leaving actually reversed everything and made it worse than it was before he got there. Now, some of that is Cody as well. There's the both
Yeah.
of them kind of being out of there. And so that is such an impact for me that the absence of CM Punk was more meaningful than any current wrestler that AEW has from a
Mhm.
positive standpoint.
So you want more evidence to what you just said about that?
Go for
If
it.
you look back in the history of Monday Night Raw and look at the year-over-year ratings each year, the two biggest years of decline, one year to the other, number one was the COVID year. Obviously, because they went to empty arena, the shows were complete shit. The booking was terrible anyways, and then you had the empty arena. The other year, 2014, when Punk left, or whatever year it was that he left, that was the year that their ratings plummeted.
Yeah.
And then when he shows up in AEW, all of a sudden they increase. I believe that a lot of those lapsed fans that left WWF in 2014 or WWE came back to AEW, and then when he went from AEW to WWE, some of them went with him.
You know, there's this big argument going on Twitter. Well, it's mostly Dave doing the arguing about what a box office draw is today, right? And so, you know, Dave's like, draws aren't kind of what they were because people are arguing that certain people in AEW aren't real draws and such. CM Punk actually is the opposite of that. Like there is real proof that he is an
Mhm.
absolute draw. He means stuff to ratings. He means stuff to attendance. He means stuff to Peacock views. And he's one of the few, right? But it's also because he was gone for a long time and they use him sporadically. They make people, I kind of want to see CM Punk again. And then he shows up in an important program. So that is also to benefit for him is there are not very many actual draws. Cody is one, Roman is one, Punk is one, and Punk showed in AEW that he also was a main draw. So I think he's got to be a no-brainer as much as people are kind of sick
And
of
his
him
in ring too. I think
Yeah.
he's one of the only people to have 5-star matches in 3 different decades.
Mhm.
That's
I wanted
the
to,
O's, the 10s, and the 20s.
Yeah,
I
for
wanted
this.
to add that
Go ahead.
last year there were a lot of people. We're talking to John Muse and whatever. The ballot came out in September and it was done by November. And so last year we had the incident in London, and CM Punk had not yet gone to WWE. And so we were all experiencing a fallout, kind of a mood shift regarding this guy. The cataclysmic shift from the time the ballot ended last year, he then showed up at Survivor Series, and where we got to when the ballot came available this year, if he makes it in off of what he did in the last 9 months, that's amazing because the mood completely shifted on him and what he was doing.
Yeah, I think in this category, the modern US, you get seven picks, right?
Mhm.
I think 4 of them were absolutely like the easiest decisions I've ever made ever. It was Cody, the Young Bucks, Roman Reigns, and CM Punk. That was easy for me. It's like, okay, there's my no-brainers. Now I got to go and do some research about my next 3 in that category. And I went and did some reading. I got on the Cage Match. I got on like, hey, what were the attendance figures in these places? How many 5-star matches do these guys have? And then, of course, I'll text John Muse like, hey, what do you think about these guys? What do you think about these guys? Like, kind of pepper the smarter guys. And so, like, my next 3, I was very, I took it very seriously and tried to make the best decision I possibly could. And that's why I went with the way that I went. And I wanted to make sure that people that were probably going to fall off the ballot if they didn't get more points, I thought that was important to give. To like, okay, I know this act right here is probably going to fall off if they don't get enough support. I think we really need to start having a conversation about these people. So one act that I know is not going to get in this year, that I wanted to start having a conversation about that I don't think anybody's actually talking about is the Hardy Boys. And so I went ahead and I used my 7th pick for them. They were like my last pick, my 7th rounder. And JD actually picked them too, which surprised the hell out of me because we didn't even talk about it ahead of time. but I don't think there's a more influential tag team in the modern era than the Hardy Boys, right?
I think Ryan Frederick voted for them too.
What's that?
I think Ryan Frederick voted for them too.
Well, he's a smart guy. That makes a lot of sense. So, so I think I don't think there's a more influential tag team in the modern era. If you go around and you talk to all the different tag teams, and then any type of X Division type cruiserweight wrestler that's out there, they've probably stolen some stuff from the Hardy Boys. They've been over everywhere they've gone. At one point in 2015, I think in 2016, when TNA was essentially dead, for like a 6-month period, they actually made them relevant again and increased their ratings by like 200% or something like that. And then got them back into WWE. Now the problem is that every time they get back together, they have a little bit of a run. One of the guys on that team decides to get himself in a little bit of trouble, and then it ends up not working out. But everywhere they go, they've always been over. And to further the point, this year's Bound for Glory, they did about 3,000 people in Detroit, right? With the Hardys and Joe Hendry essentially drawing the house, right?
Yeah.
And Hardys were the main event. Joe Hendry was a very big part of that draw. A year ago at Bound for Glory in 2023, they did about 1,000 people in Chicago with Will Ospreay kind of drawing the house. So that tells me like these guys are legitimate drawing cards everywhere they've ever been. And the Young Bucks, the Motor City Machine Guns, Private Party, you know, go on down the line. They've all been influenced in some form or fashion by the Hardy Boys. I think it's time to have a discussion.
Super influential. But here would be my, you gave a fantastic argument for them. Now, I'm not talking about the late 90s, early 2000s version of the Hardys. I'm talking about the current version of the Hardys, or maybe the last 5 years. What I see, and this may just be, you know, anecdotal, I haven't looked this up, is they come in hot, they stick around, and then they overstay their welcome. And by the time they're done, people are sick of them. That happened in WWE. They came back for that WrestleMania in Florida, over like crazy, coming off of that ROH run, over like crazy. Soon thereafter, not as over. Now, you mentioned there's also some stuff with Jeff kind of screwing things up. Right? AEW, I sort of felt the same way, like coming in hot, really interesting. And at some point you go, okay, they're not the Hardys that we remember in the ring, and thus they lose a little bit of that steam. Now, Matt has reinvented himself a couple of different times, and I think that has been awesome. Like his creative mind has been fantastic for him. But then, you know, and they're back in TNA, and I think it's awesome. But at some point, how soon until maybe they lose a little bit of their flavor there?
You know what? I think that can happen with WWE. I don't think Vince really saw it in them anymore, and he kind of just drove them down the card. And with AEW, they never really got going. Like they had the one match with the Young Bucks, and then Jeff Hardy started to Jeff Hardy. So, so I don't know that the audience got sick of them
killing people with those swanton.
I know.
Oh
so
my God.
There is a fringe group among AEW fans, because AEW has the word elite in their title. They also think that they're elite, these fans. They act elitist and they talk down to everybody. And they think that if you're not filled with kicking out of every move, and you're not doing 2.9s like crazy, and every match is a 5-star match, they think that somehow you're not that good. And that's how they were kind of treating the Hardy Boys. And of course, Jeff Hardy'd himself. So I don't know that it was so much that everybody got sick of them. I think it's, you know, there's some behavioral issues. Jeff got a DUI, and so that kind of what ruined that run. But I was talking to Ibu from Wrestle Purist a couple weeks ago. He was on the pod, and he said that when he was at an AEW show in New Jersey, the Hardy Boys were on Rampage, and he says typically after Collision or after Dynamite's over, people just head for the hills no matter who's on Rampage. But because the Hardy Boys were wrestling, he said he didn't remember who they were wrestling. He said they're waiting for it, and it was like seeing your childhood heroes come back out, and everybody stayed to watch Rampage just because the Hardy Boys were on, and that was during the AEW run. But look, I try my best not to judge people's careers based off of when they're washed up. I try to look at them at their peaks and how long their peak was, and I think their peak was a long time. Now they have some ebbs and flows and you know, ups and downs and things like that. But we're talking about these guys that have been on television for over 25 years. And so, of course, there's going to be peaks and valleys. And when you're a tag team and you've been a tag team for that long and you're working in American mainstream promotions, they typically don't put those tag teams in a position to be able to draw. Hardy Boys are the exception to that rule. So I just want to start the conversation. I want people to start looking into it. They're not going to make it this year. I know that, but it's time to start advocating and really think hard about those guys.
I have two soft roadblocks on this. And the first one is, this is personal. I usually leave only one spot for a tag team in each category, just for the space of it. And there was another tag team that kind of took that spot this year that you had already mentioned.
Yeah.
So you gotta I gotta think about the space management for them. When it comes to the Hardys as a whole, though, the thing that holds me back is not that their personal problems cause problems for them, but their personal problems cause problems for the promotions that they were in, and the damage that they would cause by the poor decision making that they had at the time. And it was consistent throughout all the promotions that I have to be compelled in some way that they've truly made a change and no longer are prone to these kind of things before I take them as seriously as other candidates who aren't prone to those kind of mistakes.
And I have a good rebuttal to that. If they were really that big of a problem for these promotions and they were costing promotions money, they wouldn't continue to get chances.
Yeah.
But
So
that's the thing.
Still
this
making
is
money.
a Hall of Fame ballot. This isn't their jobs on the line. This is the elite honors that they get. And so you have to take all of that into account. And some people will and still believe positively. I'm just saying personally, that is something that I take into consideration.
I want to say about the Bucks, like you brought up washed up, or not the Bucks, the Hardys. They've been killing it in TNA this year. Like it's so under the radar, nobody's noticing it, but they're having great matches like every month on the specials and TV. When you put them in with the system, it's basically an old school tag team match with the Heat, and then Jeff Hardy gets his one high spot in. Matt works the most of the match, and it's good, and the fans are totally into them, and they come off like. I've turned such a corner. Like when they were in AEW, like every time they were on TV, I was just like, I don't want to see these guys anymore. And when they're on Impact, like it's a highlight of the show every time. So I think that's
environment matters.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the treatment of them, the way they're presented by the promotion and the way the fans react to them.
Two quick things on what Mike said. One, does Ibu have a ballot?
No. At least I don't think that he does. I've never seen him talk about it. He should get one though, because he
should have a ballot. He's a smart guy. Very few people watch as much wrestling as he does, except for maybe Paul, and take kind of like a big picture look about what they just watched. And he does that very well on Twitter. I'm just like, man, you're wasting this to Twitter when you could be, putting this somewhere else. But that's part of his that's part of why reason people like him a lot, is because he's doing that on Twitter. And the second thing is you just created a podcast idea, all elitist wrestling, where you just sip tea and raise your pinky and you talk about how, this wrestler screwed up on this way, and back in my day, it would have never had that's a podcast. I don't know. I think
if Parker was still around, that's what the Dynamite Show would be now.
Yeah.
What happened to Parker? I haven't seen Parker in forever.
Last I saw, he was in Taiwan actually.
Yeah, with his debate team.
So,
yeah. Wow.
Good for him. Amazing. Honestly, that's way more important.
Yes. Okay. A couple of quick ones, and you guys can talk about other folks who you are standing for, or maybe who you just absolutely will not vote for, while we kind of talk about this. But strategy, Jeremy mentioned a strategy of only voting for one tag team per category to leave him some space. I don't like hard and fast rules necessarily, but one of my rules is, it's just part of the kind of the thing of it is, like Paul said, I didn't vote in Europe. I don't feel qualified to vote in Europe is the main thing. But also a lot of the historical stuff, I try and stay out of it unless there's just, someone mentioned John Muse. Having access to John Muse, I don't think he even understands how beneficial that is to just wrestling knowledge and wrestling. I just learn something every time I talk to him. Now, some people in Discord may think that he might slap him in the head for saying something dumb. I'm fine with getting slapped in the head for saying something dumb too. But the history ones or the categories are the ones that I have a little problems with. If there are people who I feel like are just injustices, like Bobby Davis, I feel like is an absolute injustice.
100%.
And it's not because I've seen anything that he's done necessarily. It's because I know who he influenced and who took from him and who all said he's the guy. And so I will vote for Bobby Davis without really even seeing anything on him. But that is one of my strategies, which is if I haven't really been able to follow them or at least see them from a historical historical context, I'm really going to just abstain and let the people who really understand that better than me. Now, some people feel, well, I have a ballot, I have to vote in every category because it just shows that I'm showing that, okay, you gave me a ballot for a very good reason. I feel like I can vote in US Modern just as well as anybody because of my span of, when I started. Japan, I feel okay in. I feel pretty solid in Japan. I don't vote in Mexico if there's a mostly historical context to it. And then, like I said, in Europe as well. But what are your strategies? Mike, we'll start with you. Do you have a specific strategy when you tackled the ballot this year and you're like, okay, here's what I want to do with it?
Yeah, so I don't really have any hard and fast rules like Jeremy did, but I did abstain from Japan, Mexico, and Europe just because I just didn't feel confident. And I want to make sure that I'm able to do enough research, and I got my ballot a little bit late in the game. I didn't think I was going to get one this year, so I was like, well, I'm not going to do all the reading that would require it. But I did want to make sure that I voted into the historical one because I've read a lot of the books on wrestling history, and I've read a lot of articles, and I've been on the Wrestling Classics message board checking out some of the stuff that like guys like J. Michael Kenyon have written in there, and Steve Yohei and all these guys. And so I just felt like I maybe at the moment that I got the ballot wasn't qualified, but I made sure that I was qualified before I voted for who I voted for. And then of course there's just articles out there that you can just read, right? Like Jonathan Snowden did a really brilliant article on June Byers. And she was not on my ballot,
right?
So on his Substack, it's for free. I get emails from him like pretty regularly, a couple times a week, and he has new free articles. And he did one on June Byers, and I read it. And it was very well researched, very well thought out, very well written. He did a great job on it, and I felt confident enough in Jonathan, who did one of my favorite books of all time, the Shamrock book. I was like, okay, awesome. I'm like, I don't think this guy's full of shit, right? So I felt like I could.
Maybe on Twitter he's kind of full of shit sometimes.
On
but
Twitter,
as a writer, he's a really good.
Probably
writer.
Don't interact with Jonathan on Twitter. He could be hot or cold, depending on who you are. He's very nice to me. I think he just likes that I'm military, but he's like very hot and cold on people. And then there's also Johnny Rougeau. Like I've never even been to Montreal. I've only seen clips of Montreal wrestling, but I didn't really know much about him. But I felt pretty confident in Pat LaProde's writing. And what Pat LaPrade has been saying about him for years. I read the Andre the Giant book that Pat wrote, and they mentioned Johnny Rougeau all throughout there about him being the promoter of Montreal and the big houses they did for years and all the great events that they promoted. So I felt confident in voting for Johnny Rougeau. I felt confident in voting for Roy Welch because of the different periodicals that are out there about Roy Welch and promoting for all those years that he did in Tennessee. So it's like if you're not willing to do the work and willing to do the research and ask the right questions, you probably don't need to vote in those categories. But I felt like I was qualified.
You made a great
about that one.
You made a great point about the research, and I am lucky to be able to kind of moderate is a strong word, but these Hall of Fame shows that we do, where we bring on these historians, John Muse and Ethan were on the last one that we did, but in the past. Pat has done stuff, Mike Tenay, when we could actually get Mike Tenay on, I was just like, my ears were just wide open listening to that guy. And so you mentioned Rougeau and Byers. I voted for both of them as well. Again, not having seen the work necessarily, but for Byers is if I'm on the Becky Lynch train, I'm on the Becky Lynch train because she's a pioneer in this industry. In an industry where it is not fair for women historically. And June Byers was able to escape this sort of unfairness for women industry as well. And so she was one that I switched on just because of having more knowledge and, listening to Muse talk about why he
Mhm.
voted for her and stuff. So, and then Rougeau for the same reason. So I'm so happy you brought up both of those. Jeremy, Paul, did you have a strategy when you do your ballot?
Yeah, well, the first thing I do is I pull up last year's ballot, and whoever was on last year and is still on the ballot this year, whether they got voted in or they were removed off, they might be off. But if they're on both years and they made my ballot last year, they make my ballot this year. So that's the first thing. So then I'm basically competing for open spots. In the modern category, for instance, like Mike brought up 4 names that he said were automatic, and I had the same 4, basically automatic. John Moxley, who I made the case for, was a 5th that I think is automatic, and Orndorff, who Mike also talked about, was 6. So then I was down to 1 spot, and I narrowed it down to 4 people, or 4 acts, I should say. And the 4 acts that I narrowed it down to, I thought all had similar cases, and they were Kevin Owens, Sami Zayn, Samoa Joe, and the Briscoes. And so when I looked at them, and I did a lot of research on all 4 of them, and I was really, really close to voting for Samoa Joe, because if you look at, I think what puts him over some of them is the houses that he drew in WWE. When he was headlining on Raw, he did like some 10,000 seat shows, with Roman, with Brock, and not a lot of people were doing those at that time. Everyone's doing them now. But in 2016, 2017, like he was bringing those numbers. When he was in NXT, they were touring big arenas and they were doing great crowds. And he was the champion for most of that. They did Japan, they did Australia. And so I really looked at that. And then I was also looking at the Briscoes and their 2 decades of top quality matches where they were one of the top tag teams in the world for 20 years. And when you talk about the Hardys, they had long breaks in between where they weren't teaming, or one was in one company, one was in another company. The Briscoes were together for almost 20 years. And then at the end, they were as good or better as they ever were, and they were a draw. So then I started looking at other ballots coming in, and I saw more people voting for the Briscoes. And so when my choice is between the Briscoes and Samoa Joe, I thought, well, if I vote for the Briscoes, they probably have a better chance of getting in than Joe. And even though I thought Joe had a really good year and added to his case by winning the AEW World title, by headlining pay-per-views, I just looked at the Briscoes and like they can't really add to their case anymore. I mean, Mark Briscoe is still around and he's doing really well, but the Briscoes is done. So for me, their case is closed, and you just have to decide, are they Hall of Famers or not? And in my opinion, they are. So that's quite a look. And so I did the other categories similarly to that, but I thought that was like the big one. I did vote for the 2 you meant, or the names you mentioned there. June Byers, Johnny Rougeau, I think are no-brainers as well. Cowboy Bob Ellis is one that I always look at too as a no-brainer. Yeah, huge draw in St. Louis. I've actually seen the work, and he was really good. I think a lot of people don't share the same.
A lot of people say that he was good for a short period of time, and then wasn't as good for whatever reason. That's the argument.
The stuff I saw was mid to late 70s, early 80s. So. Yeah, I was impressed. I was not expecting it to be as good as it was. So.
Here's a question about folks like Joe and the Briscoes, in that ROH is still around. This is just me, my opinion only, not opinion of anybody else. I feel like this version of ROH is a very bastardized version of Ring of Honor, right? Because not that I was a giant Ring of Honor fan, but I have like 4 or 5 Ring of Honor DVDs just because of the great, you'd hear word of mouth about how great these shows are. And that's really how I really started following Bryan Danielson's career, was through word of mouth on some of the matches he was having. Do you think if ROH was actually utilized a little bit better than it is today, I kind of wonder if you could put more shine on the Briscoes, their career. You could put more shine on what Samoa Joe meant to that brand. Danielson's already in. You don't got to worry about that. But, there's those type of talents. Like, I wonder if ROH kind of leaned into their history a little bit more on, because AEW is a big brand, that would actually help those acts.
I think so, if you start re-educating the audience. But I'll be honest, I didn't vote for the Briscoes, and I love the Briscoes because Ring of Honor never made any money, right? And the Briscoes were there forever. They didn't sell tickets. They didn't sell pay-per-views. They had opportunities on television. They had opportunity on HDNet, and they blew it. They had an opportunity on Destination America right after TNA, and they blew it. And then ultimately they went out of business, and Briscoes were there the whole time. So if drawing power is part of it, until like their last 3 matches with FTR, they weren't really draws, right?
But if they're so high on the other two, then that can override the drawing power, and I think they are.
It could based on it, but I did feel like they were influential. I felt like the Hardys were more influential when more people saw them. Right?
I'll give you that.
You know what I mean? So I just didn't think that being being the best in Ring of Honor is that important to me. At least to me, I'm not a historian like Paul. Like I just
but they're not just the best. Like they were one of the best tag teams in all of wrestling.
They're great.
The whole 2 decades.
Yeah.
Like that's gotta
awesome.
mean something.
I think Mark's run and him keeping Jay's memory alive, I think that's going to eventually get them in. It may not be now, but I do think that they will eventually get in. I wanted to get to this question from Darius, since Darius has given us great stuff. Do you think Dick Ebersol should be considered for the ballot?
Yeah,
Dick Ebersol. So just for people who don't know, Dick Ebersol had a relationship with Vince McMahon, which enabled them to get on NBC for Saturday night's main event. I actually read Ebersol's biography, and he has a little anecdote in that he would get a call from Macho Man Randy Savage the next day to see what the overnights were for the Saturday night's main event. Macho Man was very interested in how they did with ratings on that show. But without Ebersol, Vince doesn't get on NBC. It was very clearly an Ebersol maneuver.
Absolutely. He should be in the conversation. I'm not saying he should go in, but he should definitely be on the ballot of someone that people consider to measure the merits of his case.
He sits in that, like, Ted. How influential is Ted Turner? Like, should Ted Turner?
I vote for Ted every year, but I
do
think that Turner is much stronger than Ebersol.
Yeah, I Ebersol's a reach for me. Yeah.
What
I'm
about?
not saying he wasn't influential? He was, but that's a bit of a reach.
Yeah. What about Paul Bearer? Is Darius's last
is
one?
Paul Ellering in?
Good question. I don't know.
I think Paul Ellering is a better case.
Unless he's in with the Road Warriors, unless he's in as part of that act, that would be the only way.
Yeah, because I think he's got a better case than Bearer.
I would be a hard no on Bearer.
Yeah. Okay.
Paul Ellering is not. I have. Speaking of Adam Berger, I have his spreadsheet always open.
He
on my computer.
just told us he's not in. I think because I mean, you go back, and even before the Warriors, he was Legion of Doom. He was he's a wrestler of some merit,
enhancement talent essentially.
Yeah, and he's still around. Like I mean, not that the last 20 years or anything for him, but he's still around, still getting a paycheck, get paid. But it's weird because Bearer is, I mean, a big part of that Undertaker act, and Kane as well. I mean, I think it's somebody you kind of have to look at, but it's tough.
I wouldn't vote for him. Like, you could put him on the ballot, but I wouldn't vote for him.
I think putting him on the ballot just is going to cause someone like me to go on a podcast and be mean. Because I had to do that to Bray Wyatt. I'm like, Dave, it's very sweet of you to put Bray on there, but now I have to go and be a jerk about someone who just passed away. So thank you, Dave.
Yeah, I mean, with Bray, it's more about his creativity and his influence than his actual, work.
Now you got me wondering if we should have had a question where we all talk about like somebody that you look at. Why are they on?
Okay. So I wasn't going to say that, but I do have a question which is similar to that, which we'll get to in a second. But what I wanted to say is, oh gosh, now I literally just forgot what I was going to say. No, but Jeremy, give us your strategy, and maybe I'll think of what I was going to say.
So I get that email, and I cut and paste the entire list into like notes or whatever, and I just start cutting names, and I'm just like, no, I don't think so. No, I don't think so. And I'll get to maybe like 10 names in a 7 category, 7 in a 4 category, just enough where it's like, okay, I need to start looking at the arguments here or there. And it's a list of names that you're like, okay, this feels like a pool in which some are going to go home not happy, unfortunately. From there, I do the reading, I do the research. I thank anybody out on the internet who's already made some kind of argument for me to read the June Byers stuff that was mentioned earlier. People talk about the Steiner brothers. I listened to Mike and JD on their Wrestling Observer newsletter episode on Brace for Impact that they do every Thursday on YouTube. Make sure you check that out. So I'm going through it, and I get to the list, and I finally figure it out, and I sit on it for a little while, and there I go. So I submitted the list, and this year I went back and I looked at last year's ballot, and it was almost exactly the same. So I think the bias just kind of exists of who I think is going in based off of the research I did in the initial get-go, and then based off of, the historical people, their case isn't really going to change. The modern, their cases are going to change. The Japanese candidates, theirs are going to change. I do refrain from the Europe and the Mexico categories because I feel it's somewhat disingenuous to have an opinion on something I know less than nothing about. And so, yeah, I do the historical. I did not use all seven choices. I just went with 5. But in most of the categories, try and max out the picks as much as possible.
I now remember what I was going to say is for Paul Bearer, we just need to use the John LaRocca corollary, which is if Paul Bearer comes on the screen and your mom or dad walks in the room when you're watching wrestling, do you get embarrassed? If the answer is yes, then I don't think Paul Bearer is a Hall of Famer.
Well, in the time and place that he was in, I don't necessarily think that would have been the case because he wasn't anymore. But you know what? The good question to ask would be, would The Undertaker, would Kane have been as big without Paul Bearer? And I think that's a conversation. Like, I don't know what the answer is, but I definitely think it's a question that would need
Could
to
you
be
put
discussed.
Kane and Paul Bearer in together as a package deal?
Well, I don't think that's a Hall of Fame act.
Father and son, you mean?
Well, if Kane and Paul Bearer are not a Hall of Fame act, why is Paul Bearer a Hall of Fame act? Or you know what I mean? They elevated each other
Paul
more
Bearer
than.
Yeah, but Paul Bearer also goes before he was Paul Bearer.
That was the same. That was part of the argument I used to make for Stephanie McMahon. Was that I don't think Triple H gets as big as he was if he doesn't have Stephanie at his side.
Or I thought you meant if he doesn't marry the boss's daughter.
Well, no, that's a whole other. I'm just talking on screen. Like, I think she was a big part of that act in the early 2000s. When they are late 90s even. And I know she dropped off the ballot, but when I used to vote for her all the time, and that was one of the things. So I might vote for Paul Bearer, but the category is so strong. I was just kind of looking at there's a lot of people on those lists that I would vote for, and I just didn't have room for.
Right.
So yeah, more to what I was interested in learning about was are there strong candidates who stick on this ballot year after year after year after year, and you're just like, enough already. Like, you've been on this ballot for 100 years and you haven't reached the thing. Why aren't we moving on? Are there folks like that for you, Paul?
No.
That's hard to say. I think I'm more the opposite, where like when guys get dropped off, I feel almost like, oh, I wish we had a little bit more time because they seem like they're getting some momentum. I'm just looking, and I know in the Mexico category, I might have said that a couple of years ago.
And then all kinds of guys got in the Mexico.
Yeah. Like, it feels like Larry Matysic's been on a while, and if he was going to get in, he'd be in already. I would just say, like maybe you could, that's a small name, but he may get in. Like, I've heard a lot of people advocate for him, but I did vote for him years ago.
So the guys would be like in the rest of the world category. Like, Spiros Arian has been on the ballot forever. Johnny Saint has been on the ballot forever. Now, I pull away from that category, so I don't really have a vote.
Ethan Tyler made a really strong case against Johnny Saint.
But the one that I was thinking about who did eventually get in was Sarge.
Yeah.
Sarge just sat on that fence for, like, I remember listening to Wrestling Observer Live back in the day, and they were talking about Sarge. And
Sting
he did eventually get in. Yeah, but I always, because of when I started watching wrestling, I was like, Sting's got to get in at some point, and he finally did. Yeah, but that whole thing is really interesting as well. Is like, how long should you like it in the major, like Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens are already off the ballot, right? You can't vote for them unless they're in this veterans committee thing. So
I feel like we might feel that way about Edge in a few years because
Edge and Randy Orton, I think.
Yep.
Yeah, Dave's pretty hard. Like, I feel like Randy Orton will probably get in at some point because Dave is
I
such a
think they
strong
both
advocate
will.
for him.
Dave's a stronger advocate for Edge, I feel,
Is he?
than
Oh,
Orton.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think both of them will probably get in as well.
There's
Yeah.
a hierarchy in my mind of people who are just ahead of them in line, and I think a lot of them are going to make it this year. So, people didn't consider them because the argument wasn't as strong as the other people. We all talk Punk, Reigns, Rhodes, the Bucks. Moxley and Orndorff have come up. I voted for Becky Lynch as my 7th on the modern. What she was able to do in the modern age was unprecedented, and that kind of needed to be recognized for me. But that's just how it's all working,
All right, last thing I wanted to do before we get out of here, we are just at 75 minutes, so right at the end of this thing, which is I look at some of the folks, and Paul mentioned one of them, Larry Matisick. I look at guys like Larry Matisick, guys like Mike Tenay, who kind of help us in their historical knowledge and their historical writings of them being involved in wrestling and them being super fans. Like, I feel like if not for Tenay and Matisick and guys like that, maybe our grasp of history isn't as good as it is. Just listening to those guys talk. I'm trying to think of who else would have done the history shows with Dave back in the day, but I'm always on for Matisick and I'm on for Tenay in addition to what they did in wrestling, but also because of what they captured. Like Jim Cornette would have been the same way, right? If he's not in, I would have felt the same way. It's like their grasp of history and their retelling of history, I think, is very important for this, for what we do, and to keep the historical knowledge of wrestling strong. So I'm always going to vote for guys like them. Any thoughts?
I think until Dave Meltzer himself goes in, I'm not sure those other two should go in, but he'll never go in. He should be in, but
there's a lot of niche candidates in there. We talked about Bobby Davis. I have Rossi Ogawa on there as
I voted for Rossi.
Just needs to get like a recognition for what he's been able to build over in Japan that has been able to benefit over in America as a result of the growth that he started there. So there's all these arguments for these people that don't get the consideration that they do. And over the course of time, I hope they don't drop off, but at the same time, I think a lot of these people's days are going to come. It's going to take a little bit of time.
I'll bet you that there's a lot of people out there looking at, like I mentioned Bob Ellis earlier, who I strongly advocate for every year. There's probably people out there like, get him off my ballot already so I can vote, so like, and that's probably, I feel like if he hasn't got in now, he's not going to get in, but I keep voting because he seems like he should be in to me. And I'd be that way for Dick Murdoch if he was still on the ballot too. I think I'd be voting for him.
All right. Darius asked if you predicted who would the 9 names be if you would predict.
Yeah. Well, I put mine up there earlier.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, in the chat. Where are they? Cody, the Bucks, Roman, Orndorff, Von Erichs, Shingo, Blanco and Wagner, Davis and Bruns.
Interesting.
I'm going to caveat. I'm only using my list because no one that I didn't vote for could possibly make it into the. June Byers, Junkyard Dog, Cowboy Bob Ellis, the Young Bucks, Paul Orndorff, CM Punk, Roman Reigns, Cody Rhodes, and Shingo Takagi, with one more to be determined.
Interesting. That's interesting. Yeah, JYD is an interesting one too, because he's kind of like that guy who's been on the ballot forever, falls off, gets back on. Wasn't there a book about him not that long ago, which kind of recaptured some of that stuff?
There was also an A&E bio on him too.
Adam's predictions. Adam in the chat. Adam predicted Roman, the Bucks, Orndorff, Shingo, and Bobby Davis as the 5 that he thinks out of the 9.
I did vote for Bobby Davis. I just didn't have him as the 9th person, but he could absolutely be the 9th person.
I can't see him not getting in. They're just, everybody I've heard talk, is talking about Bobby Davis, and and then Bruns is the other one that I think if he doesn't get in this year, he'll get in next year based on the same kind of thing. If Roman doesn't get in for the reasons that I think it was
We riot.
Adam said, what?
I said we riot. I was just kidding.
Maybe it's
you mean
JYD.
Darius was talking about
Yeah.
Lanza.
Yeah,
Lanza's
maybe it's
anti-spoiler.
JYD then, based on the the WON tracker and that that maybe he gets in and not Roman. I think Punk, it's going to be tough for him to come from as far back as he was last year.
44, I think.
44,
Right?
Yeah.
Darius said. Good job, Darius.
Actually,
with some of those numbers.
44 to 60. Is it 60 or 70? It's 60, right?
It's 60, but it
60.
was a pretty cataclysmic shift that he made.
Yeah, but that's from last year. So
Right,
that
that's
was
what I'm
right
saying.
after he got fired. So yeah, 44 to 60 would not be unprecedented. Yeah. Because I think he may have got in last year if he hadn't have gotten fired.
Soured everyone's opinion of him
Yeah.
at that exact moment.
Exactly.
Because I definitely feel like what happened right around that time, I was deeply affected. My perception of him.
A lot of people I've talked to. I know John Muse said the same thing, and I think he had voted for him before, and he's voting for him now, but last year he did not.
It was a wait and see thing. Like, how do you bounce back from this?
Is he gonna blow up some houses on WWE television? All right, I really appreciate this. Mike had to run a little while ago. He again, he has a newborn, so his family. He was waiting on naps to be able to do this. But I appreciate Mike Gilbert. Check him out, him and JD on the Mike and JD show on the Voices of Wrestling Network and their Patreon, which he mentioned already. Thanks, Paul and Jeremy. You guys got your stuff going on as normal this upcoming week. I failed to mention, but I wanted to acknowledge our good friend, Robert Silva, who passed away of a heart attack. And, I learned about this. Gosh, I feel bad because it was probably like, a week after that it happened that I finally learned about it. But Carlos Toro and I are going to have we're going to do a live stream after the Tyson and Jake Paul fight on Friday night. And we're going to share some stories of Robert on that show.
Awesome.
And Paul, I guess we got something coming up with Jones and Stipe. We'll do a little bit of a preview at some point this week as well.
That's next weekend, right? Yeah. So we'll do a preview, and then maybe I'll probably be on Wrestling Observer with you guys next week. I did a thing. If people want to learn a little bit more about Robert and get to know the guy behind the voice, they could Google Robert Silva and Grandpa Dez. I did a show with him, and we had a great conversation, and we actually talked a little bit about mortality, believe it or not. So,
well, I don't know if you saw his last tweet.
I did.
Yeah, it was he was not shy. Like he knew of his father's life, and he's very aware of all of that stuff, but just a fascinating person, someone who I just love that dude. I
enjoyed collaborating with him behind the scenes. I really did.
So Carlos and I will have some stuff on him. But by the way, ChatGPT, if I'm a top 20 reporter, something's going on because I don't even report. I just do podcasts. But just being a part of that network just gives us visibility. So all right.
I was between Will Washington and Kathy Kelly.
Hey, you know what? Good for you, Paul.
Yeah, that'd be an interesting evening. Anyways.
All right. Thank you guys for doing this. So for Mike Gilbert, for Paul Fontaine, for Jeremy Finestone, I am Double G. We will see you when we see you. Peace out.